You smell the leftover cologne in the jacket they hand you, sweet and stale. Voices murmur behind you, plates knock on glass, and the living room lamp pools yellow light over the empty chair. "Just sit there for a bit," someone whispers. "It makes your aunt feel like he's still here." The fabric is still warm from a body that isn't coming back. They ask you to speak in his phrases, to laugh the way he laughed, to keep a ghost from noticing it's gone. Stretch this room to a palace and give the grieving man an empire. That's the room Sporus was pushed into. He entered the record because he resembled a woman who was no longer alive. Poppaea Sabina, Empress of Rome, had been the axis of Nero's world. In the early years, he looked almost reasonable for a Caesar. He trimmed taxes, sponsored public entertainments, and played at artist in a city that liked to pretend its rulers were practical men. But power without refusal rots quickly. By the mid-60s CE, Nero could not breathe unless applause filled the air, and Poppaea became the private audience whose approval steadied him. Her death is the fracture where every source begins to argue. Some accounts suggest fever. Others report a domestic quarrel that turned violent, a kick or a blow that felled a pregnant woman and the child she carried. All agree on what followed. Nero's mourning became a state religion. He spoke to her body as if it answered. He had her embalmed rather than burned, crowned her divine, and drenched the palace in perfumes until marble smelled like a tomb. In the echoing silence of that palace, grief went looking for a replacement and found a face. Sporus was a palace youth, slight, fine-boned, eyes too like the portraits now hung with wreaths. The resemblance became an argument, and the argument became a plan. Physicians whose careers depended on imperial favor learned to call violence a remedy. We will not rehearse the procedure. It is enough to say that the boy's future was altered in a room that smelled of vinegar and smoke, and afterward he was expected to answer to a different mirror. Nero called him Sabina, the dead woman's name, because language shapes obedience, and then he announced a wedding. The tailoring began. Silk speaks when it moves, and he learned to make it quiet. Tutors drilled gesture and gaze. A jeweler fitted earrings that had known Poppaea's skin. The emperor announced a wedding. Priests who understood survival blessed what everyone understood as performance. On the registry it read like any union: names, rings, dowry. In reality, it was a funeral dressed as marriage, a ritual designed to keep a ghost seated at the emperor's side. In public, Sporus was displayed as empress. In private, he learned the arithmetic of danger. One word too soon, one glance too late, and the temperature of the room changed. He studied Nero's moods as a scholar studies omens. He adopted Poppaea's poses, drank from Poppaea's cups, walked at Poppaea's speed. Survival is a role that demands perfect recall. Every day was opening night and closing night at once. Rome watched because Rome always watches. The city had tolerated excess from emperors before, but this was different. Castration was no Roman custom. Law and disgust kept it at the margins. That is precisely why Nero's solution shocked. It advertised that his will could bend even the taboos Rome used to recognize itself. Courtiers clapped. Servants looked at the floor. The rest of the city told the story to itself with the relish of people who cannot look away from the edge of a cliff. Then the emperor took his theater on tour. Nero wanted an audience that could not risk laughter, so he sailed to Greece to sing and race before judges whose jobs were to award him wreaths. Sporus traveled with the retinue, veiled and attended, a living relic borne through cities that pretended not to notice the fiction in the litter. The empire was large, but rumor is larger. News of the boy bride traveled faster than the yachts. Back in Italy, patience thinned. Governors calculated odds and chose rebellion. The Praetorian Guard auctioned loyalty. Senators who had praised Nero's art found their prose shifting into condemnation. In June of 1968, the emperor fled to a suburban villa with a small court of the faithful unfaithful. Sporus was there during the last strange hours, hurried orders, packed jewels, a horse stamping in the courtyard, while a man who called himself divine asked a secretary how to die with dignity. Later writers polished last words and arranged props. The only certainty is that Nero died and the empire did not. What happens to a symbol when the man who invented it is gone? Rome answered with its usual efficiency. It treated Sporus like property, moving with the title. Nymphidius Sabinus, a praetorian who fancied himself emperor, took him first and paraded him as empress, a stunt meant to spray Nero's perfume onto his own ambitions. When Nymphidius fell, Otho claimed the boy, not out of love, but because stealing a rival's costumes is a kind of politics. Then came Vitellius, boisterous and coarse, who liked his jokes with knives in them. Chronicles allege he planned to force Sporus to play Persephone in a public assault staged for amusement. That was the spectacle too far. Sources report the boy chose poison rather than be dragged on stage again. The story could end there in a grim full stop, but it leaves behind a map worth walking. Begin with bodies and law. Rome regulated bodies with fanatic care. Who could marry whom? Who could wear what? Who could claim a lineage? It also insisted that the citizen's body be inviolable. The Sporus episode is grotesque precisely because it breaks Rome's own rules in a way only a sovereign insulated by fear could attempt. When citizens looked away, they were not only afraid, they became complicit in an exception that proved the emperor's power had no borders but his appetite. Next, consider the shelf where we store truth. Our main witnesses are Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. They agree on the marriage, the renaming, the display, the tour, the afterlives under Nymphidius, Otho, and Vitellius, and on the end. They also wrote with motives sharpened by hindsight. Tacitus distrusted theatrical emperors. His moral lens hardens whenever art and authority mix. Suetonius adored scandal the way fish adore water. He gathers filth and jewels in the same net and invites you to enjoy the contrast. Dio curated disgust for the benefit of a senatorial audience that liked to feel clean. So we say sources report and chronicles allege, not to soften the blow, but to be honest about how memory is made. Also, read the machinery behind the spectacle. Nero could not do this alone. It required physicians who converted pain into policy, artisans who reshaped appearance, priests who wrapped power in ritual, guards who defined safety as obedience, and a city that preferred gossip to courage. Place those instruments end to end, and any age can build a similar device. The technology changes, the logic does not. When someone with unanswerable power decides that grief entitles them to remake a person into a solution, the culture around them supplies the thread, the needle, and the choir. Picture a dinner after the wedding. Lamps throw honey across the table. Senators rehearse their faces. A flautist misses a note and goes pale. Sporus lifts a cup, and a pearl earring trembles. Nero turns to him and speaks to the dead woman as if she has answered. In that moment, you can see the real hinge. The emperor is not only cruel, he is desperate. The court is not only obedient, it is trapped in the geometry of fear. And the boy is not only a symbol, he is a person calculating distance, angle, and breadth.
If you look for ordinary people in this story, you find them in the edges. The seamstress who hemmed the wedding veil, pricking her thumb and watching a drop of blood bloom against white. The barber surgeon who told himself he was preserving art. The clerk who balanced an account book that listed a dowry paid in someone else's future. These are not monsters. They are what happens when a palace teaches clever people to name obedience compassion. There are other lessons. Grief does not grant the right to conscript another life. When private worship becomes public policy, someone is about to be used as an altar. Institutions often enable what individuals invent. Ask who holds the knife, but also who sharpened it and who paid for the whetstone. Demand verbs that do not blur who did what to whom. Euphemism is a hand over a mouth. You may ask how old he was when he decided not to allow another performance to rename him. 16? 19? The record will not say. Analysts treat him like a prop, fitting for an era that turned people into furniture. But a better telling lets him keep at least one decision. Refusal can be an act, not only an absence. When the only choice left is how to leave, the choice still matters. By the time Vespasian steadied Rome and money replaced rumor as the empire's spine, Sporus was already dissolving into anecdote. Yet the echo returns whenever a ruler turns loss into theater and assigns a stand-in to make the picture look right. In smaller rooms, the same logic survives. Workplaces ask you to imitate founders so clients will not notice the weather has changed. Families push the living into the outlines of the dead and call it comfort. States decide memory is safest when it is choreographed. The difference between mercy and manipulation is who gets to keep their name. One more truth lives under the marble. Nero's grotesque marriage worked because the city had trained itself to translate power into beauty on command. The same crowds that wept at tragedies could applaud a law that hurt their neighbors if the stagecraft dazzled. Priests adjusted incense, poets adjusted metaphors. The machinery of culture clicked into place around the emperor's need and made it sound like piety. When people tell you spectacle is harmless, remember how quickly a song can become a curtain, and a curtain can become a wall. The story that began in incense and iron ends as so many Roman stories do, with a man alone choosing, timing. It is not victory. It is not only tragedy. It is the recovery of a name for a moment long enough to set it down. Sporus vanishes from the record with a gesture historians report in one line. Yet that line refuses the role written for him. It is a thin kind of mercy, but in palaces, thin mercies are the only ones that pass the guards. Remember the wake chair. In that ordinary room, you are asked to be a substitute for someone who is gone. In a happy household, the request dissolves into shared stories and quiet. In a cruel one, the request hardens into a role. In an empire, the role becomes a ceremony no one can safely interrupt. That is the distance between sorrow and spectacle. That is the road this story walks, and the reason it still returns with the smell of myrrh and iron in the air.